And we are live, hopefully. Hello and welcome, Empty Chat Room, to the debut of my Swanshawn Booktube #1 Golden Hour, or whatever I actually will decide to name this. I really wanted to just create kind of an informal way for me to talk about books that did not require me editing for hours upon end, and also talk about things not necessarily book related but within the fantasy genre, and have an easy place for me to actually go and talk to other booktubers without having to actually put together everything. Hello, Therese. Cool, I'm glad to know it's actually working. But this is the first one, so it's very much not super organized. So I'll probably keep this to around an hour just to see how it actually is working out. But I planned on talking about what's happening this week in my TBR, give some general book thoughts, talk about some non-book but fantasy related things. I've been kind of stuck in the Korean manhwa scene for a little bit, where a lot of my free time's just been stuck reading just Korean webtoons, and it's become a problem because every time I get a break from work or anything, I just wind up just reading chapter after chapter after chapter of these web serials that just go on for thousands of hours. But hello, Celefrina. Welcome to the debut Golden Hour #1 Booktube live show, or whatever the official name will eventually be. I've never done a live show before, so this is going to be interesting, with the chat and just how going back and forth. I will probably be a little ADD with the initial one of just people kind of popping in and saying hello, so excuse me for being a bit scattered. Let us see. So I guess I haven't posted a bunch of the new reviews of books that I've been doing recently, but I did wind up releasing that The Wandering End book 1 kind of recently, and I had to stop myself just to going into the third and fourth book, just because I wound up just binging the second book almost immediately, and that's a 60-hour book, so didn't want to just have everything mixed up in my head. But that one was super good, great one. Let's see, Beware of Chicken. I think that's a progression fantasy. I don't actually know a lot about it, but I want to say that's a lit RPG of some sort, right? And while that's happening, I also got into, speaking of lit RPGs, Dungeon Crawler Carl. And that was a weird mishmash of just 80s lit RPG, everything. A lot of fun, just a giant, complete mess of everything. And while not the most literary accomplished thing, it was just a blast to read through, and I just kept actually going through there. Oh, hey Dom. Okay, cool. So if you're getting into more lit RPGs, some of the favorite ones that I actually got into, and it just kind of depends on what actually draws you into lit RPGs, but I did The Wandering End recently, which was probably one of my favorite recent ones. But before that, I would say Ascension Online was one of my favorites. Not the normal you're in the video game and you die thing that happens with a lot of lit RPGs, but was probably one of the more interesting mechanic stuff that was happening, and just having that be more of the VR dystopian setup and everything. I wound up really enjoying that and binging through that. But I think that's more on the meta video game element of anything. The Land by Alarin Kong was really good too for the first few books before it completely just spun off the rails, and I think got a little bit crazy. But Ascension Alliance fun. Dungeon Crawler Carl, if you're just looking for an 80s action just mind-melting trippy thing too. I just recently got through that. Get through the first 2 hours worth of it on audiobook, 50 pages, and it's a lot of fun too. Let's see. Hey Shad. Amazing jokes, some other character. I like the puns. Prince of Nothing, that's something that I really want to get into that I just haven't got into there. I've been neglecting a lot of the grimdark stuff, but I've heard that's one of the just most twisted like grimdark series that you actually can get into. And just if you're looking for like dark grimdark, it's really amazing. But I've had that recommended from other people who I know had good recommendations for grimdark, so that should be a lot of fun. I'll pick that up eventually. There's another one too that I don't see a lot of people talk about, but that's Michael Fletcher. He did Beyond Redemption, and that's probably like one of the most twisted like books I think I've read in a while. One of like the grossest, weirdest magic systems I can remember recalling. But it's like every other page they try to remind you that yes, this is grimdark and just like super gross and dark and everything. But I cannot remember reading anything like that in a long time. And I heard that the author gets better and better. I've only done the first two, but that was still pretty good as well. Yeah, The Wandering Inn. I said this earlier, but I had to stop myself from just like binging completely through like the next few books. I got past the second book and just absolutely loved that one. I thought it was like a lot better, but I hadn't reviewed it yet, and I have this problem where I'll just like read six, seven books in a row, review like two of them, and then just everything gets like mixed up in my head. So when I try to review it, it's just like this giant mishmash of things. That's also coincidentally why it's like taking me so long to get through Reaper's Gale. It's because I keep reading through it, kind of having it in my brain, but then I need a break from Malazan, so I read a lit RPG, and then like I'm trying to remember hardcore Malazan things, but then Carl is just running through my head, blowing shit up, and it's just a weird mishmash. So I have to either just immediately record myself after each chapter or figure something out, just a better note taking system, because when you mix those things up and try to mix like high prose of like Erickson with like lit RPGs, it just gets like really weird and makes it hard to actually be coherent with some of these reviews. Yeah, the narrator on The Wandering Inn was just so amazing too. Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews had a interview with Pirate Abba, and like they did like graphics and everything for it, and had the narrator actually like go in and answer all the questions. And that's when I was like really hooked on that narrator specifically. Just did such an amazing job, and just the way they like immerse you in the world was just like really crazy to see. But huge fan of the series, and I'll probably once I actually get the second book review out and start like diving back into that. But that's going to be probably one of those book series that are just going to displace a lot of the other things I'd planned to read just from like sheer enjoyment. But absolutely loved it so far. It's definitely one of the more unique lit RPGs I can remember reading in a while. But yeah, I started talking about Dungeon Crawler Carl. I recorded a review for that I need to edit, and then I'm now like book three, so I still need to like film the second one. But that's like it's good, but it's not like the wandering in unique, just kind of different things that kind of sucks you into it. So if you're not already a fan of lit RPGs, I don't know if it's going to be great, but there's like a talking Persian cat, and the main character is just like a big everyman that just like blows stuff up and just has like great catchphrases and anything. So pure enjoyment scale of that one was like pretty good. Let's see. I mentioned earlier too about like Korean manhwas, but if you are into like webcomics and that type of thing, one thing that I got like super addicted to was Skeleton Soldier Couldn't Protect the Dungeon. It's one of those like Groundhog's Day type situations, or Mother of Learning too is like a pretty good progression fantasy, not quite like lit RPG. Oh, cool. Thanks for stopping by, Dom. Go get some lifts for me. But kind of like Mother of Learning, you just have like a big time loop that's happening, and I won't spoil too much for it, but the art style is really cool, and just the sheer insanity of like where the plot goes and everything is just like really insane, and had a lot of fun with that. But I think there's like 1,500 chapters or something ridiculous like in it, and I wound up just like having that eat up like an entire weekend where I just like could not like put it down. So that was like highly addicting as well. Okay, Cradle's pretty good. The world building in that, it's a lot of fun, and same with like magic building. I think Will White has like one of like the better like world building magic systems that I can remember reading. I was watching like Matt's review of his new series, The Engineer, and I've heard that's like really good. Mainly because like Cradle, while it was like great with all like the plot building and everything that was happening, or not plot building, magic building and world systems they were building, the Engineer actually has a plot, and it's like much more expansive. And it was like, Will Wright wrote like 10 books in Cradle, or 11, however, whichever one Waybound was. But then like with this one, he took all that stuff and like actually started a new series that seems pretty good. Doesn't seem like it's like taking off so much like in sales, but I definitely want to pick that one up just because I really like Will White, and the dude definitely can make his own like crazy magic systems and really has like that progression part like actually like narrowed in. But that was a lot of fun. Hey Sam. Oh thanks. That was I think when I did that one I was like doing a December challenge with my brother where it was like I was trying to like post every day and like shorts were just like way easier to edit. So I think that was like midway through it and I was just running out of like ideas of things to do. So I just started trying to slap insanity stuff against the wall, and surprisingly that one did like super well for like 20 seconds and just kind of trying to be cheeky. Yeah, Mother Learning was really fun. I really enjoyed it. It was a bit of a slow start, and I haven't finished it, but I think I got through the first four books, and towards the end, it kind of like lost the plot, so I don't know how it wraps up. But I will say the first three books were just highly addicting fun. One of those like I couldn't put it down. So for like just pure progression fantasy, it was just cool, and I might just be a sucker for like time loop genre things. Just like the going back, redoing everything, and just watching how you can like break the plot thread. It just is a lot of fun. So if you like that and progression fantasy, Mother Learning is pretty fun. And another one of those like indie web serial guys that like managed to like become successful enough to like become a writer, which is always like the dream goals. Do Maladan's weird, Sam. I did not like the first two and a half of the books, so I didn't get into it till like halfway through Memories of Ice, which is like a huge undertaking because each of these books are between like 1,000 to like 1,500 pages. So some people loved it from the beginning. It's very different, especially like the first two books, and like the prose and everything is good. It's just very disjointed. I heard someone say once that if you were going to read it, treat it like a collection of short stories, like kind of going around the world, or kind of like if that first book for The Witcher, like if it wasn't just focused on one character. But Gardens of the Moon is, I think, rough for most people. So get through that. Some people absolutely love Dead House Gates immediately. And then like Memories of Ice is a lot of people's favorites books once they get into it. But one thing I will say is as you like get deeper into the series, the urge to reread it is just super strong. So once you pick up enough pieces to actually understand like what the hell's happening or kind of like under there, then you're like, oh, I want to go back now that I understand this and reread it. So I feel like you never really enjoy Malazan or at least have the full picture until you reread it. But when I got through book three and into like book four and five and six, those were like some of the most epic things that I have ever read. So once you get hooked in there, but there's still a slog. So I'm slowly trying to get through like the seventh book. And there's a lot more philosophy than I thought, but definitely one of the more like epic, weird, crazy fantasy things I've ever read. And I don't think they're in the first couple books, but there are dinosaurs that have psychic powers and laser eyes and swords for hands. So that's something you can actually look forward to. Yeah, I feel kind of the same, Therese. I, the first few books especially, I don't think I enjoyed reading them, but when I was like making the reviews and going back through like what actually happening and trying to like get coherent thoughts together for a review, just the act of like kind of doing that crazy like murder crime board type of thing of putting each different string together and trying to figure out like what I actually read, that was extremely enjoyable. So it was like fun after I finished reading it, which is not an experience I've ever had with other like fantasy books. So it's difficult to get through, but it is rewarding to get through, which is interesting. It's like when you read like in high school or like early on, they have like those literary classics that are just like a slog to get through, but have all these like hidden meanings and stuff inside of it. I feel like Malazan was written in a very similar way, except there's dragons and dark elf things and swords and epic battles. So it's basically like classic literary stuff, but with cool things nested inside of them. Okay, I mean that's like what got me into it too, Chad. Was I was like watching like Philip Chase especially, just because I think he has his like PhD in medieval literature, but he's actually a good friend with Stephen Erickson. But He actually breaks everything down from like a super high literary concept, but like going through his videos made me appreciate Malazan a lot more. So a lot of like the revolving like external Malazan content I think is like really awesome and fun, but just actually getting through it and trying to understand that level of what happening, I feel like I'm like a 2 year old just kind of like kicking, like going through it, and then like having someone like much more intelligent explain it to me. I was like, oh, this is really cool, and now I feel accomplished for having get through this. Okay, I haven't read Books of the New Sun, but I definitely want to check that out sometime. I'm actually gonna make notes. I also have a mechanical keyboard, so apologies for unintentional ASMR. But yeah, now Malazan's an interesting one. I think it's like once you read enough fantasy and you're just looking for new things and like you're not deep in that genre, it's definitely like worth just jumping into because if you can get through it, it's really rewarding and pay off. But for some people, it's just not their cup of tea. If you get through like book three and you don't like it, you're probably not gonna like it. But then there's also people like Mike's book reviews who got to like book seven, and then just was like, I'm I'm taking a very long break now. I can't do this anymore. So sometimes you just need to like space it out. Some people can just like crank out book after book after book. I'm not one of those people. I have to take breaks in between, but I go back and forth, especially with like book seven, where it's like, this is the best thing I've ever read. Oh my God, this is amazing and epic. And then it's like, skim, 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 skim. No, I missed something important. Go back. Let me like actually read this again and read like chapter summaries going on. Oh yeah, Philip's awesome. He started reviewing some of my favorite series like the Dresden Files and stuff, and just like watching someone take an actual like studied literary take on some of these other fantasy books I think is really interesting. I tend to lean more towards like, while I like deep classical works and I've read a lot of like classical literature, I don't really focus on that as much. So watching him like apply that like filter to things that I think are just more enjoyable than anything, if not necessarily deep, or just more focused on the storytelling rather than technical things, it's always interesting seeing his take. But for me, I read a lot of classic fantasy when I was younger, like Tad Williams. I really liked Raymond Feist, which I don't know if he'd be considered classical fantasy. I mean, most of his stuff was like released in the 80s, but then if you go by that like logic, then would Game of Thrones also be like classic fantasy? I did like Tolkien a lot, so I read that when I was growing up, but it's definitely something I need to dive more into. The one problem with like going back into like classic fantasy at least is that so many people have taken those concepts and run with them like so many times. So I've read a lot of modern fantasy, so it's like I'm seeing some of these things that were really original for the time, but now that I've read all the more nuanced new versions of that, going back can always be a little bit rough. I like going classic sci-fi just because I think some of those were really unhinged, and it's a little easier to like do that than classical fantasy. But definitely something I want to like explore more of. Oh yeah, Critical Dragon is pretty great too. There's a few people out here that like made like Malzahn their specific booktube focus, which I think is very commendable. I do not have the attention span to like just focus. Oh, looks like I reconnected. What was I saying? Oh yeah, if you like go through like my channel content, you'll just see it's like a really weird array of just different genres of books and then shit posts and me trying out weird stuff because I never had the attention span enough to just like fully focus on there. But some of these guys that have made like channels for like years where all they talk about is like a specific book series or like Malazan specifically. I mean, Malazan's great just for the level of dissection you can do and stuff you can make. The amount of like weird sketches I've like had to like pass on making just because it would have been too just hyper specific to like someone who had to have read that specific scene, was just getting quite high for it. But always cool to see those guys just like specializing. So for audiobook, I do mixed media, so I will occasionally like read it on audiobook. But the thing with Malazan is so many different things happening and so many different plot threads that it's really hard to get the full picture of it on the first one. So if you can just sit down and focus and do it through audiobook, that's great. Especially after, I didn't like the first narrator, but after that, it was, I think the narrator really improved. And some of the scenes, like group scenes, were like actually like really elevated and hilarious just because of the narrator. But I think audiobook would be amazing on a reread. But if you're trying to just like have everything like put together and like understand what's happening, it's a lot to ask of your attention span. But I mean, it's doable. I just, when I do audiobooks, I'm like driving or hiking or doing other stuff, and I'll just like miss like major critical plot things. And I was like, oh no, I'm actually gonna have to read this chapter, or just go through. They have like Malazan, Book of the Fallen reread, where you can go like chapter summaries by like Tor. So you can do that and then actually like have someone explain it to you, and then also like decipher like what actually happened, which is always interesting. But it's doable. Just probably not the best bet. Oh yeah, Dresden Files was a series I got into when I was like much younger, but just absolutely like love Jim Butcher's writing style. I think for all of the issues it has, watching him like grow as a writer was one of the coolest things, and especially like Dresden's like character changes, just seeing like the character progression of him from the very first book to some of the most recent things was probably like some of the most insane I've ever seen. But also it's like hyper focused one character and like his POV just for like 16, 17 books now. So absolutely adore that series. So for top 5 series, honestly it changes a lot for my mood, but for like fantasy specifically, I think for sentimental reasons, the Dresden Files has to be on there. I really like Joe Abercrombie, so I'm just gonna lump all of his stuff together from the first trilogy, standalones, Age of Madness. I haven't finished all of it, but absolutely like love that level of grimdark and has some of my favorite characters and just all the fantasy. I really liked Wheel of Time. I think it has a lot of issues, but that was like my first like big epic like fantasy that I got through that I really enjoyed and just really liked Robert Jordan's like writing style. There is that slog from like books 7 through like 10 that is very hard to get through, but that's a series I think with audiobook actually really like pays off too, because you can just have it going while you're doing other things and listen to Nynaeve like tug or braid 50 times, and it's like not as grating if you were actually just like sitting there and trying to like figure out like what was happening and distract yourself a little bit. uh let's see, I think by the time I finish Malazan, it will be in my top 5 just for like the literary achievement that it actually has been. I mean, I'm 7 books into it out of 10, not counting like the standalones, but for what it's done so far, while it's been like a big slog to actually like get through all of that, just what Erickson's like pulled off and like the levels of epicness, I think even though I haven't finished it, I've heard it does like actually resolve really nicely. So I'm gonna throw Malazan up there. And let's see, fantasy specific. I'm gonna cheat and look at my bookshelf. I think it'd be hard not to put like Brandon Sanderson up there too for his like Cosmere series, just because of the crazy level of like world building and expansion he's done it. Not the most like crazy prose, but as someone who has made repeated Grim Post after Grim Post, I will say the series definitely like captivated for me just for like series. There's like debuts that I like more that haven't finished, like Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora is like in my top like 5 books, but he's doing like the Patrick Rothfuss thing with some different details. But book 3 people or book 4 people have been waiting for quite a while for that to come out. But that's like one of my favorite like all time books too. Yeah, the Dresden stuff's like really interesting. I mean, I think Jim Butcher wrote his Stormfront when he was like 19 and then published it like when he was like 21 or 22. And so with him trying to like combine two like unique genres, especially like taking a lot from like the whole like detective noir stuff, I mean that I think played a little too much into it. But I remember being 19, so when I read that book, I think I actually was like 19. So for me, I still like absolutely loved it and have a lot of the issues other people have, but I get why some people complain about it. I think Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews did like top 10 most overrated series, and he did point out for like Dresden, like there is a level of like neck beardiness that happens with Dresden, but that's still like one of my favorite all-time series. So even though like I think that's like valid criticism with like some of the white knighting and stuff that happens with him, I still like absolutely like love that series. So it's one of those. I've never read a perfect fantasy book, and there's always going to be like weird issues with like characters, just because writers are flawed too. So trying to get that not to come through in your writing or putting in flaws in your writing, I think is interesting. If Justin didn't have all of that crazy sort of views and stuff, like I think the books would have been a lot less chaotic and the plot would have been a lot more straightforward. So you can't have like a character with like no character flaws. So making him like grounded in that stuff was, I think, like a good choice. And reading Butcher's other stuff like the Aeronauts Windless and the Furies of like Calderon. I mean, I think this was just a specific choice to Dresden, which I think works like in the environment he's in. But he's an interesting character study. Yeah, that definitely was a problem with Wheel of Time. The first six were amazing, and then it just kept getting more and more bloated. But the problem with some of those is some of the most epic moments of the series like happens within that big bloated slog, so you can't even like skip through that. I remember in one of my rereads, I was just trying to get to all like the good parts, and like I would just get to like the forward part and just realize that I missed like a major event and one of the coolest parts like of the entire series. So definitely has some issues too. It would have been interesting if Robert Jordan stayed alive and just to see how he actually would finish everything, but having Brandon Sanderson just like swoop in and just like tie everything up and like take out a lot of the bloat, I think was a pretty good choice. But it would have always been interesting, like what would have happened if like Robert Jordan like stayed alive long enough to actually finish it. Yeah, no, if you get six books into a series too and you're just like not feeling it, then it's like I liked the first six a lot. So getting into the rest of them, I had enough momentum to just kind of carry me through everything. But if you're like six books in and you're just like, yeah, no, you don't have to finish it. There's enough stuff out there too. I mean, it would have been great if the adaptation was more faithful, but there are other medias and YouTube channels that have dove into the series that you can always just like find out what happened or just get a recap of like 7 through 10 and then just like repick it up after that because the last like 2 3 books actually were like really really good, but a lot of slog to get to like the good parts for that. Oh, for sure. But I mean, like, Martin was a middle writer for a very long time. He actually has a book I don't see many people ever talk about, but he wrote a steampunk vampire book that was kind of like a horror series, I think, before Game of Thrones. That was really good. But he has been writing for a very, very, very long time. And so when he finally got into like Game of Thrones and everything, it's like the skill he had like making that was just amazing. And I heard too, like Robert Jordan, if you read the first like few books of like The Wheel of Time, it's more like quest fantasy, epic fantasy. But I heard that after Robert Jordan started reading like George R. R. Martin and like Game of Thrones, that's when you see a lot more of like the Days de Mar and like political intrigue actually go in and do that. So I think that was more of a late addition. While like for George R. R. Martin, that was like his whole plot for doing that in the first place. But definitely Game of Thrones, the first 3 books at least were amazing, but I think they had the same problem kind of as Wheel of Time did once you got to like books 4 and 5 with just like the bloating and not knowing where the plot's gonna go. It's morbid, but I don't think we're ever gonna see the end of Game of Thrones, or if we are, it's gonna be probably rushed. But I think he's put himself in a corner where you're just like, what's gonna happen next? I don't know. I think he's gonna have to figure out too, and especially with how like the TV show ended. Maybe that was supposed to be like the original ending for that, but having everyone like turn on the TV show, I could see him also just being like, I should probably like stay away from what I was going to do, and then now let's like refigure out how to do all of this. But I mean, George R. R. Martin seems to be having fun. Him helping out with like Elden Ring. I saw some like memes I think today where it was like the Drake meme, but like George R. R. Martin, and it was like calling the enemy a dumb poo eater, and it's like no, calling it like a lumbering dung devourer, and it's like yeah, that's what we should do. So having him like go into like other series and and just take some of that expertise into other things. I've so far what he's like collaborated on, I've really enjoyed. Oh yeah, I've heard about those. I can't remember the guy's name, but this was someone who came up around like my same class when I started doing like YouTube, and he had a Nintendo cartridge as like his profile picture, but he did like really cool video essays, and he had something for Robert Jordan where it was like what the Wheel of Time was originally supposed to be, and it was going to be much more like grim dark portal fantasy that was like much more just like dark and messed up and everything, and I think I would have much rather have seen that. And there were still some elements of that, like the traveling stones were supposed to be just like way bigger too, but he had all of Robert Jordan's notes and just did like a cool video of just how he like put it all together and just what it was going to be originally, and it was going to be like much more like steampunk and like seemed like a probably more unique fun read. I need to remember what the guy's is. It's been like a year since I saw that video, but it was like really good. Yeah, the first three is that's when I got into it, and I was like, this is amazing, and that carried me into like books 4 and 5, and that's when I started like falling off of it. I liked his prequel novels too, with I think the character's name was Egg, but it was like the not the one that they spin off like House of Dragon from, but it was like the early Valerians and stuff, and it was like a young Valerian that shaved his head and his like bodyguard. That was a lot of fun, and I wish there were more of those, but I haven't heard anything about that in a very long time, and that was like I think 5 or 6 years since like I've last seen anything about that. Though speaking of kind of like grim dark or crazy like fantasy things, I recently too got through the Fall of House of Usher. I really like that TV director that has been doing things. He did like The Conjuring and Midnight Mass. So if you're looking for something spooky to watch, I highly recommend it. It kind of took the Edgar Allan Poe original work, set it in like modern times, and just kind of ran with it. But all of the actors in there were just like really amazing, and some of the like CGI and effects they did, it was either like top tier spectacular or like really goofy. So at no point did I ever thought like the show was like scary, but it did like a great job of being like spooky. But just the George R. R. Martin stuff reminded me of it because a lot of bunch of different like plot points, what's going to happen next, mysterious like fantasy dark forces. But that was a lot of fun to get through. I was like stuck in an airport on like a 4 hour layover and like just watching it on my phone, and I was still like getting goosebumps in the middle of like a crowded airport, just watching it off like a tiny screen and everything. But that one was a lot of fun too that I got through recently. Is he actually? Oh, that's gonna be amazing. I That's another one that I was like super sad about how they adapted it originally, just because I thought that was a crazy series they could just go off the rails with, and instead it just was like weird action fantasy movie thing. I remember like that initial disappointment I had like growing up because like the Aragon adaptation I think was my first taste of like people like trying to like adapt fantasy very poorly, and with only a couple exceptions that seems just like one of those genres that they don't if it's not animated I don't see it ever really like taken off super well. Okay, yeah, Scott Eastwood. That'd actually be like great. Especially like I was just thinking like young Clint Eastwood, but I forgot what he was in. I saw something with like Scott Eastwood into it, and like dude definitely can act. So seeing like the actual like Wild West type setting going through everything would be amazing. Yeah, it wasn't great, but it was like that. I remember being excited about the original Avatar: The Last Airbender adaptation that was also truly terrible. Um, a lot of TV adaptations. Who was that guy? Controversial one. Wizard's First Rule. I think Terry Goodkind. They like adapted Terry Goodkind's like series, and then it just turned all into like weird BDSME stuff, and just was like kind of crazy. Let's see, underrated fantasy. Mm, there are, I think, a lot of series that like really took off like before the internet that a lot of people don't talk about now. Raymond Feist's Rift War, I think, is definitely underrated. It was very popular at the time that it came out, but I never see people talking about Raymond Feist. And I think that's going to change because they are doing an adaptation for his stuff, I think, in the next like year or two. So I'm expecting to see a lot of booktubers like start hopping on like the Raymond Feist like train and trying to like cover those. But that was like I reread the first two books recently and they still like hold up. Starts off kind of like campy 80s fantasy coming of age thing, but then it just like quickly devolves into like portal magic, grimdark, war, everyone's dying, character growth, but still has a lot of those like 80s like elements that feel good to it, which I still enjoy. But it's easier to say like overrated series. I'll look at my bookshelf again. I think Brent Weeks gets slept on a lot too. I liked his Lightbringer series or the Black Prism series a lot. The ending is absolutely controversial, but one of the most like creative, innovative like magic systems I can remember reading, and the dude does mystery boxes super well. So that's a series I don't see a lot of people talk about, but Raymond Feist is a pretty good writer. I mean, he did that. I forgot the name of it, but they had like the assassins jumping around that were called like Wet Boys. That was more like teenage fantasy or young adult fantasy that like had some issues, but I feel like he grew a lot by the time he actually got into the Black Prism. So that's one I don't see a lot of people talk about. Same thing with like Scott Lynch. Liza Locklemore is like definitely in my top 3 or 5 books of all time. I think because he hasn't finished the series, then you don't see a lot of people talking about it as much. But I've seen like smaller booktubers talk about like how great it is to Shelf Centered Bryce. He That's like his favorite book as well, and we've like talked about it. Let's see, some of the series that I thought were underrated seem to be like picking up a lot of traction too. I really like Red Rising, but now that Pierce Brown's getting into the later book and getting a lot better, I was like part of that. Matt's like 100 something booktubers like say what their best debut of the year was for like 2023, and I think I saw like 7 or 8 entries just for like Lightbringer. So I don't think that would be considered underrated anymore, but the first 3 books I like really enjoyed. Lightbringer is definitely a easier read than Malazan, so I would say if you I started Malazan over a year ago and I thought I'd be able to read it like one a month, and that was absolutely not the case. But the Black Prism series, that's it's not as complicated as like a Song of Ice and Fire, but it is more complicated than the Dresden Files and King Killer, mainly because there's like multiple characters that are happening at the same time, so you do have some plot threads. And Brent Weeks is amazing at making mystery boxes, so he's really good at like setting like these little cliffhangers and like coming back to things and like is this actually happening or not. But the prose I would say is pretty straightforward. So that's like closer to like the Dresden Files. Not super purpley, but for him, the appeal more is like the magic system he built, the mystery boxes, and kind of like intrigue and suspense he's able to like bring into it. And then also like, once again, book five, I won't spoil anything, but has one of the most interesting like go for it moments that I think an author can take in like writing a series like that. So absolutely controversial, but like what he did just because like I like when a writer just like does stuff like that, because it's like, you know, you could have made a different choice, but you just decided like you were gonna go for it, and like just the payoff for that was really good. Night Angel, that's what I was trying to remember the name of it. No, I read the first Night Angel book, but I haven't finished the series, though I have heard that him coming back into it after finishing the Black Prism, that it's a lot better than it was, just because he wrote like a whole ass series in between that. So I've heard pretty consistently good things for about it, but I definitely need to go back and finish the Night Angel. It might be. I don't think you necessarily need to read the first one, but a lot of the things that people complained about the Night Angel like first series, they said that Brent Weeks like went and fixed it, but it's still very much like one of those like progression fantasy like power leveling type things. So if you like that already, you'll probably like the new one. But I think that was Brent Weeks' too like first series he wrote too. So there's like 8 books in between the first book and then like the newest one that came out. So it definitely like improved as a writer. One thing you don't see is like whenever I do like reviews, especially the ones that go like for like an hour long, I like to just like pause it, get up, drink water, just to keep not talking for like 45 minutes. So the original idea for like this live stream was going to be like maybe 2 hours long, with like bringing on like other booktubers and stuff and like collaborations. And I had like a bit of a rough outline for this that I'm going to have to figure out eventually. But for the debut, I just wanted to make sure that I actually had the ability to like turn it on and read the chat. Let's see. I also have a strategically loaded crim posting Reddit page loaded up in case I ever ran out of things to talk to. I could switch the window capture to that and then just start scrolling through Reddit memes like any good streamer does. Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate it. Good talking to you. Appreciate all the love and support. So I'll see you next time. You take it easy. I appreciate it. Peace out. Me too. Hopefully that happens, but you know, with this, I had some more plans, and I'm definitely going to get back into doing more sketches now that I have this. And ideally, I'll be able to talk more about the specific books I've been doing without having to make a review for everything, which takes up a big chunk of my time. But hopefully, more shit posts are on the way, and I have a ever growing list of absurd content I really want to make. So hopefully, you can look forward to that pretty soon. Okay, so I think the other two things I had here to actually like talk about was like a video game section. So I absolutely adored Baldur's Gate 3 when it first came out, and I had a lot of fun playing through the plot and like choosing like a charisma based like class, doing the bard thing, talking to everything, and the writers of Baldur's Gate 3 were just absolutely amazing. I used to really love the Forgotten Realms what was it? The Dragonlance series? Yeah, that was basically like D&D rules, but just like pure just D&D, just questing fantasy and everything, with like the D&D level of people becoming gods and ascension, and just a lot of fun. And even though I've only played Dungeons and Dragons like 2 or 3 times, I've always enjoyed like the world and rule systems and like everything that goes into that. So getting able to like play Baldur's Gate 3 was a lot of fun as it was intended. But recently I re-got into it and just decided to like make a complete meathead character, which I normally don't do. So I've been just running around as like a barbarian, picking up like goblins and throwing them at people while setting them on fire, and it's been an absolute blast. Fantasy, kind of related, but something I wanted to mention. If you ever picked up that game and started to get bored of making like decisions or actually figuring out like how should I go and make the best option for this, don't do that. Instead, just pick a meathead class and literally like pick the barbarian option every time. And probably the most fun I've had playing a video game in a while. The other one that I've been playing a lot of too was Slay the Spire. So if you like roguelike card-based games, that one's a lot of fun. They have a mobile version of it, which is why I've been playing a lot more of it. But one of the best like card games I can remember playing in a while. And just a lot of fun, roguelike, just every play is different. You can go through ascension levels, so it just gets harder and harder and harder. But another one of those things, like those Korean webtoons I was talking about, just absurdly, absurdly addicting and just a lot of fun to get through. So if you're looking for more time wasters to do when you're not binging my insane content or other like book related things, that's something else I can recommend. Cool. I think everyone now is out. I will save the scrolling crim prosts for another time. But thank everyone for stopping by. If you are watching this at a later date, probably not going to put timestamps in any of this because I just wound up talking to chat for the majority of the time rather than the clearly defined thing that I had planned originally. But seems like this works. I can interact with things and have a general idea of what to expect for next time. I have a few people on the behind the scenes that I've been talking to that I'm going to try to have on guests and just kind of have a back and forth with that. That will hopefully be pretty fun. The cool thing, I think, or the coolest thing about BookTube that I've done so far is just like the behind the scenes, like talking to other BookTubers about stuff. And sometimes I've been getting on like Discord chats or like just actually video calls or phone calls with some of these other guys who have like a really big passion for books. And the whole reason I originally started this, other than the fact that my end goal is to be like an indie author, is that I have like two friends I can talk to about like fantasy books about with or sci-fi books about with or just books in general. So actually having a community of people who were just dedicated enough that where they just decided to spend hours and hours of their time like making videos and reviewing things and trying to like build their own channel. It's just a lot of fun, and just the conversations I've had so far have been just an absolute blast. So next week will be the next one. I think for now I'm going to try to keep this going on Sundays, but once I get this going a bit more consistently, then I might change the time a little bit. But hopefully to have some guests on next time and a little bit more organized in segments and everything. But we will see. But thank you all for... Ah, man, I can't cut now. Anyway, thank you all for stopping by. Appreciate you checking this out. As always, I appreciate your time, and I did start a Discord, so if you want any announcements or to shoot the shit in a more casual setting, click on my channel. Links in the description. I don't think it's on this broadcast, but thanks, and take it easy.